August 15, 1943, Imperial Navy Headquarters, Tokyo Bay. Admiral Kenji Yamashiro's weathered hands trembled as he set down the radio message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The words seemed to blur before his exhausted eyes, but their meaning was unmistakably clear. Combined fleet operational capacity reduced to 30%. Request immediate withdrawal from all forward positions. In the suffocating silence of the war room beneath portraits of Emperor Meiji and Admiral Togo, Japan's most decorated naval commander faced the unthinkable reality that the Empire of the Rising Sun was losing control of the Pacific. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table that had once hosted celebrations of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies now bore the weight of defeat. Charts that had shown the expanding reach of Japanese naval power were marked with red crosses indicating sunken vessels, abandoned bases, and retreating fleets. Admiral Yamashiro, architect of the early Pacific victories and protege of the legendary Admiral Yamamoto, stared at these symbols of collapse with the hollow expression of a man watching his life's work crumble. At 57 years old, Yamashiro represented everything the Imperial Navy had once embodied. Educated at the Naval War College, veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, he had spent 4 decades believing in the superiority of Japanese naval doctrine, the invincibility of Japanese fighting spirit, and the inevitability of Japanese dominance in Asian waters. His uniform, immaculate despite the chaos surrounding him, bore ribbons from a dozen campaigns that had once seemed to prove Japan's destiny as the master of the Pacific. The war room itself told the story of Japan's maritime ambitions. Constructed in 1938 as the nerve center of naval operations, its walls displayed detailed charts of every ocean from the Aleutians to Australia. Brass fittings gleamed under electric lights that had been installed to enable round-the-clock planning sessions. The latest communication equipment connected Tokyo to fleet commanders across thousands of miles of ocean. Everything had been designed to project power and coordinate victory. Now it served as a monument to miscalculation. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, Yamashiro's chief of staff and closest confidant, entered the room carrying another stack of reports. At 42, Tanaka possessed one of the sharpest analytical minds in the Navy, a graduate of both Tokyo Imperial University and the London School of Economics who spoke fluent English and had spent 2 years studying atomic and industrial capacity. His presence beside Yamashiro represented the intellectual partnership that had driven much of Japan's early naval success. Their collaboration had produced the tactical innovations that overwhelmed Allied forces in the first months of the war. Admiral Tanaka said quietly, his voice betraying none of the emotion that showed in his dark eyes. The submarine reports from the Solomons have arrived. He placed the documents on the table with the careful precision of a man handling his own death warrant. We've lost another 6 cargo vessels this week. The supply situation on Guadalcanal is becoming untenable. Yamashiro nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the charts before him. Each red mark represented not just a strategic setback but the deaths of men he had trained, commanded, and sent into battle with absolute confidence in their ultimate victory. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the crushing depth pressure that destroyed submarines in the deep ocean. The transformation from triumph to disaster had been swift and bewildering. 18 months earlier, Yamashiro had stood in this same room planning the expansion of Japanese naval bases from Wake Island to Port Moresby. The combined fleet had been the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, commanded by officers who had studied every aspect of warfare, and equipped with vessels that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. Victory had seemed not just possible but inevitable. The seeds of doubt had been planted at Midway, though their true significance had taken months to fully comprehend. When news of the defeat first reached Tokyo, Yamashiro and his staff had attributed it to misfortune rather than fundamental flaws in Japanese strategy. 4 aircraft carriers lost in a single day seemed like a catastrophic accident rather than a symptom of deeper problems. They had assumed that Japanese industrial capacity and fighting spirit quickly compensate for the setback. "Do we have confirmation on the Congo?" Yamashiro asked, referring to one of Japan's most prestigious battleships. The question came out in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the feared answer more real. The Congo had been his first command as a young captain, the ship where he had learned to balance the technical demands of modern naval warfare with the spiritual elements that the Imperial Navy considered essential to victory. Tanaka's hesitation provided the answer before he spoke. "She went down with all hands 3 days ago. American submarines caught her convoy southeast of Truk. The escort destroyers never had a chance to mount a counterattack. His voice remained steady, but his hands clenched and sully as he delivered the news. The Congo's loss represented more than the destruction of a warship. It symbolized the end of Japan's ability to project power beyond its home waters. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional crackle from radio equipment monitoring fleet communications. Both men understood that they were witnessing the collapse of everything they had worked to build. The Imperial Navy that had dominated Asian waters for half a century was being systematically destroyed by enemies they had once considered inferior in skill, determination, and fighting spirit. Admiral Yamashiro rose from his chair and walked to the large map covering the eastern wall. His finger traced the shipping routes that had once carried Japanese conquest across the Pacific. Red pins marked the locations of naval victories that had seemed to prove Japanese superiority. Blue pins, added more recently, showed the positions where Japanese vessels had been sunk, Japanese bases abandoned, and Japanese forces retreated. The blue pins now outnumbered the red by an increasingly alarming margin. "Captain Tanaka," he said without turning from the map, "in your assessment, what is our current operational capability in the Central Pacific?" The question was purely academic. Both men knew the answer, but Yamashiro needed to hear the truth spoken aloud. Acknowledging reality was the first step toward understanding how completely their strategic assumptions had been proven wrong. Tanaka consulted his notes, though the numbers were already burned into his memory.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
We have 18 operational destroyers, 11 cruisers, and 3 battleships capable of offensive operations. Our carrier force is reduced to 2 ships with fewer than 60 aircraft between them. Submarine strength is down to 47 boats with less than half available for combat patrols. Each statistic landed like a physical blow, reducing Japan's once mighty fleet to a collection of numbers that could no longer inspire confidence. The contrast with their strength at the beginning of the war was staggering. In December 1941, the combined fleet had included 10 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 38 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. The submarine force had numbered more than 70 boats. Japanese naval aviation had possessed nearly 3,000 aircraft operated by pilots who were among the best trained in the world. The industrial base had been producing new vessels at a rate that seemed to guarantee continued expansion of Japanese naval power. And the Americans? Yamashiro asked, though he dreaded the answer. Intelligence reports on American naval construction had been arriving with increasing frequency, each one revealing capabilities that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. The industrial might that Japan had hoped to cripple at Pearl Harbor had instead been transformed into a manufacturing juggernaut that was producing warships faster than Japan could sink them. Their Pacific fleet now includes 12 aircraft carriers, with 6 more launching within the next 3 months. They have operational control of approximately 40 destroyers, 23 cruisers, and 8 battleships in our theater of operations. Intelligence estimates suggest they will have doubled their submarine force by year's end. Tanaka's voice remained clinical, but each number drove home the magnitude of Japan's strategic miscalculation. The American recovery from Pearl Harbor had defied every assumption underlying Japanese war planning. The attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power for years had instead galvanized American industrial production and popular support for the war. Rather than negotiating from weakness, the Americans had used their temporary setback as motivation to build a fleet larger and more capable than any in history. Yamashiro returned to his seat, suddenly feeling every one of his 57 years. The stress of command during wartime had aged him rapidly, adding lines to his face and gray to his hair that made him look decades older than his chronological age. Officers who had served under him before the war barely recognized the man who had once projected absolute confidence in Japanese victory. How did we miscalculate so completely? The question was addressed to Tanaka, but Yamashiro was really asking himself. As one of the primary architects of Japanese naval strategy, he bore personal responsibility for assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. The planning that had seemed so thorough and logical in peacetime had crumbled when confronted with the realities of industrial warfare. Tanaka had been preparing for this question for months, analyzing every aspect of their strategic failure in an attempt to understand how such intelligent and dedicated officers had made such fundamental errors. His answer came not as criticism but as the professional assessment of a man trying to learn from disaster. We assumed that American industrial capacity could be negated by destroying their Pacific fleet. We believed that their geographical distance from the theater of operations would prevent rapid reinforcement. We estimated that American popular support for war would collapse after initial setbacks, forcing their government to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japan. Each assumption had seemed reasonable at the time, supported by careful analysis and historical precedent. The first miscalculation had been perhaps the most crucial. Japanese planners had studied American industrial statistics and concluded that distance and logistical challenges would prevent the Americans from bringing their full productive capacity to bear in the Pacific. They had calculated that destroying the existing Pacific fleet would provide Japan with at least 2 years of naval superiority, time enough to establish defensive positions that would make American counterattacks prohibitively costly. Instead, American shipyards had launched vessels at a rate that exceeded even the most optimistic Japanese projections. The Liberty ships that carried supplies across the Pacific were being produced faster than German submarines could sink them in the Atlantic. Aircraft carriers that should have taken years to build were entering service within months of being ordered. The Americans had demonstrated an ability to wage war on multiple fronts simultaneously while maintaining production levels that Japan could not match even when concentrating all resources on the Pacific. We also underestimated their technological capabilities, Tanaka continued. Their radar systems, their cryptographic security, their coordination between air and naval forces. We assumed that Japanese fighting spirit and superior training would compensate for any material disadvantages. This admission was particularly painful for both officers who had dedicated their careers to the belief that moral and spiritual factors could overcome technical limitations. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized the importance of fighting spirit, rigorous training, and tactical innovation. These elements had produced victories against numerically superior Russian forces in 1905 and had enabled Japan to dominate Chinese waters during the 1930s. The assumption that these same factors would prove decisive against American forces had seemed logical based on historical experience. The reality had proven different. American technology, particularly in radar and communications, had neutralized many of Japan's tactical advantages. American pilots, while perhaps not as individually skilled as their Japanese counterparts at the beginning of the war, were being trained in greater numbers and equipped with aircraft that matched or exceeded Japanese designs. Most importantly, American industrial capacity had enabled them to replace losses at a rate that made Japanese tactical victories strategically meaningless. Admiral Yamashiro opened the leather portfolio that contained his personal correspondence with fleet commanders throughout the Pacific. The letters and radio messages documented the slow disintegration of Japanese naval power in the words of the men who had witnessed it firsthand. Reading them again, he could trace the exact progression of their strategic collapse. A message from Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul, dated 3 months earlier, captured the growing desperation. Enemy submarine activity has made resupply impossible. Request permission to evacuate remaining aviation personnel before base becomes untenable. Kusaka had been one of Japan's most aggressive commanders, a man who had never retreated from any engagement. His request for evacuation marked the beginning of a pattern that would be repeated at bases throughout the Pacific. Another communication from Captain Saito commanding destroyer forces in the Solomons revealed the tactical problems that were multiplying across Japanese operations. American radar advantages make night surface engagements impossible. Enemy aircraft locate our formations before we can approach firing positions. Recommend suspension of further surface actions until conditions improve. These tactical assessments, arriving from multiple theaters simultaneously, painted a picture of systematic Japanese disadvantage that could no longer be attributed to bad luck or temporary setbacks. The most disturbing reports came from submarine commanders who had once been Japan's most effective weapon against American shipping. Commander Hashimoto's final transmission from I-58 had been typically laconic. American anti-submarine measures have improved dramatically. Convoy attacks no longer feasible with acceptable loss rates. Returning to base for reassignment. The submarine force that had been expected to strangle American supply lines was itself being systematically hunted and destroyed by increasingly sophisticated counter measures. The intelligence failure has been particularly devastating, Tanaka observed, referring to reports that American forces seemed to anticipate Japanese movements with impossible accuracy. Our operational security appears to have been completely compromised, though we cannot determine how the Americans are obtaining their information. This observation touched on one of the most puzzling aspects of Japan's recent defeats. Time after time, American forces had appeared at precisely the locations where Japanese planners had assumed they would be absent. Convoys that should have proceeded unmolested found themselves under attack by submarines that seemed to be waiting in position. Airstrikes launched against what intelligence reported as lightly defended targets encountered heavy fighter opposition that suggested advance warning. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but Japanese investigations had failed to identify any obvious sources of information leakage. The possibility that American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes was too disturbing to contemplate seriously. Japanese communication security was based on systems that their own experts considered unbreakable without access to codebooks and cipher keys. The idea that Americans possessed the linguistic and mathematical skills necessary for such an achievement challenged fundamental assumptions about Western capabilities in areas that Japanese education had always emphasized. Admiral Yamashiro closed the portfolio and looked directly at his chief of staff. "Captain Tanaka, I need you to prepare a comprehensive assessment for presentation to the Naval General Staff. We must acknowledge that our current strategic position is untenable and recommend immediate changes to our operational doctrine." The admission represented a complete reversal of everything Yamashiro had argued for during the previous 2 years of war. The assessment would be politically dangerous for both officers. Acknowledging the extent of Japanese naval weakness would challenge the official narrative of continuing resistance and ultimate victory that sustained civilian morale. Military leaders who had promised victory and delivered defeat risked not only professional disgrace but potential charges of defeatism that could result in imprisonment or worse. More personally, the report would represent Yamashiro's acknowledgement that his life's work had been based on miscalculations that had cost thousands of lives and threatened Japan's survival as an independent nation. The strategic assumptions he had helped develop, the tactical doctrines he had championed, and the operational plans he had executed had all proven inadequate when tested against a determined and resourceful enemy. Tanaka nodded grimly, understanding both the necessity and the danger of such an assessment. "Admiral, should the report include recommendations for negotiated settlement?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the cigarettes that both men had been consuming in increasing quantities as the military situation deteriorated. The possibility of negotiated peace had been discussed in whispered conversations among senior officers for months, though never in official forums where such discussions could be interpreted as defeatism. The question was whether Japan's remaining naval forces could inflict enough damage on advancing American forces to achieve negotiating leverage, or whether continued resistance would only increase the eventual cost of defeat. "Include options for both continued resistance and negotiated settlement," Yamashiro replied after a long pause. "The Naval General Staff must understand our true capabilities and limitations before making strategic decisions that will affect millions of Japanese lives." The compromise reflected his understanding that political realities would prevent any immediate acceptance of negotiated peace regardless of military necessities. As evening approached, the war room gradually emptied as staff officers completed their daily reports and departed for quarters that offered little relief from the stress of managing a losing war. The communication equipment continued its constant chatter, bringing updates on convoy movements, air raid warnings, and casualty reports from across the Pacific. Each message added another piece to the puzzle of Japanese defeat. Admiral Yamashiro remained at his desk, reviewing personnel reports that documented the human cost of Japan's strategic failures. The list of dead and missing officers included many of his former students and subordinates, men whose careers he had guided and whose potential had been extinguished by tactical decisions he had approved. The weight of personal responsibility was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Captain Tanaka returned to the war room carrying tea and rice balls that would serve as their evening meal. Wartime rationing had eliminated the formal dinner service that had once marked the end of each working day, replacing it with simple food that reflected the growing scarcity affecting all aspects of Japanese life. The change was symbolic of the broader transformation that had turned victory into defeat and confidence into desperation. Admiral Tanaka said as he set down the modest meal, "There is one more matter that requires your attention. The communication from Admiral Koga regarding future carrier operations." He handed over a mail that had arrived during the afternoon, marked with the highest security classification and requiring personal acknowledgement from fleet commanders. Yamashiro read the message twice before its implications became clear. Admiral Koga, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, was proposing a final carrier operation designed to achieve decisive results regardless of cost. The plan called for concentrating Japan's remaining naval aviation assets in a single massive strike against American forces advancing toward the Philippine Islands. The proposal represented the kind of desperate gamble that had characterized Japanese military thinking throughout the war. Rather than accepting gradual defeat, Japanese commanders consistently sought single decisive battles that would reverse their strategic position through superior fighting spirit and tactical innovation. The pattern had produced temporary victories followed by more devastating defeats as American material advantages ultimately prevailed. "What is your assessment of Admiral Koga's proposal?" Yamashiro asked, though he already knew what his chief of staff would say. Tanaka's analytical mind had consistently provided accurate evaluations of Japanese capabilities and limitations even when such assessments conflicted with official optimism about the war's progress. "The operation has little chance of achieving its stated objectives," Tanaka replied with characteristic directness. "Our remaining carrier aircraft are insufficient to penetrate American defensive screens and our pilots lack the training levels necessary for complex coordinated attacks. The most likely outcome is the complete destruction of our remaining naval aviation without corresponding damage to American forces." This assessment was particularly painful because both officers understood its accuracy. Japanese pilot training programs, once the world's most rigorous and effective, had been shortened and simplified to replace losses that were mounting faster than experienced instructors could train replacements. The pilots now available for carrier operations possessed courage and dedication but lacked the hundreds of hours of training that had made their predecessors so formidable. American pilot training, by contrast, had been expanded and systematized in ways that produced competent aviators in large numbers. While individual American pilots might not match the skill levels achieved by Japanese veterans, their superior numbers and equipment more than compensated for any individual deficiencies. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses more rapidly while maintaining reasonable quality standards. "Yet we cannot simply ignore Admiral Koga's directive," Yamashiro observed. "The combined fleet command structure requires compliance with operational orders, regardless of our tactical assessment." This statement captured one of the fundamental weaknesses in Japanese military organization: the inability of field commanders to modify obviously flawed orders based on local conditions and superior information. The rigid command structure that had served Japan well during peacetime and in early wartime victories had become a liability as the strategic situation deteriorated. American military organization, while not without its own bureaucratic problems, generally allowed field commanders greater flexibility in adapting orders to changing circumstances. This adaptability had enabled American forces to exploit unexpected opportunities and recover from initial setbacks more effectively than their Japanese counterparts. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Sato, the communications officer responsible for maintaining contact with Japanese naval forces throughout the Pacific. His expression suggested that he brought more bad news, adding to the accumulating weight of evidence that Japan's position was becoming increasingly untenable. Admiral Lieutenant Sato reported with a formal bow, "We have lost contact with the Truk garrison." Their final transmission indicated heavy air attack with multiple hits on harbor installations. Communication equipment may have been destroyed or the base may have been evacuated. The loss of contact with Truk represented more than a communication failure. It suggested that another major Japanese stronghold had fallen to advancing American forces. Truk had been considered Japan's Gibraltar in the Pacific, a fortress that could serve as the anchor for defensive operations across a vast area of ocean. Its airfields had provided bases for long-range reconnaissance aircraft that monitored American fleet movements. Its harbors had sheltered Japanese task forces and provided maintenance facilities for vessels operating thousands of miles from home ports. Its capture or neutralization would open direct routes for American advances toward the Philippine Islands and ultimately Japan itself. Admiral Yamashiro studied the large strategic map that dominated one wall of the war room. Red pins marked Japanese bases and strongpoints that had been established during the early months of the war when Japanese forces seemed capable of unlimited expansion. Blue pins showed American positions that had been growing steadily as superior industrial capacity translated into overwhelming tactical advantages. The progression of blue pins told the story of American advancement and Japanese retreat with devastating clarity. "Gentlemen," Yamashiro said after a long silence, "we must face the reality that our strategic position has become untenable. The question is no longer whether we can achieve victory, but whether we can avoid complete destruction of Japanese naval power." This admission represented a psychological watershed for officers who had dedicated their careers to the belief that Japanese victory was both possible and inevitable. The acknowledgement of impending defeat required both men to confront personal and professional failures that extended far beyond their individual responsibilities. They had been part of a military establishment that had promised the Japanese people victory through superior spirit and tactical excellence. The reality of industrial warfare had proven those promises to be based on fundamental misunderstandings of modern military capabilities. Captain Tanaka gathered the documents and reports that would form the basis for their assessment to the Naval General Staff. The compilation represented months of analysis and soul-searching as professional officers struggled to understand how their carefully developed plans had produced such catastrophic results. The process of acknowledging failure was painful but necessary if Japan was to avoid even worse disasters in the months ahead. Admiral Tanaka said as he prepared to leave, "Tomorrow's staff meeting will require decisions about resource allocation for continued operations."
You want me to prepare options based on current capabilities or projected future strength?
The question reflected the growing gap between official assessments of Japanese strength and the reality documented in field reports from across the Pacific. "Base your analysis on current capabilities," Yamashiro replied. "We can no longer afford planning based on wishful thinking about resources that may never materialize." This instruction represented a break with standard Japanese military planning, which had consistently assumed that fighting spirit and determination would compensate for material disadvantages. As Captain Tanaka departed for the night, Admiral Yamashiro remained alone in the war room, surrounded by the maps and charts that documented the collapse of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of communication equipment and the occasional footsteps of sentries making their rounds. The building that had once bustled with confident planning for Japanese expansion now seemed like a mausoleum for dead ambitions. The personal cost of defeat was becoming increasingly apparent in Yamashiro's correspondence with fellow officers throughout the Pacific. Letters from old friends and former students described not only tactical setbacks but the psychological strain of commanding forces in hopeless situations. The tradition of fighting to the death that had sustained Japanese military morale was beginning to crack under the weight of repeated defeats against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and improving tactical capabilities. A message from Captain Watanabe, commanding cruiser forces in the Philippine Sea, captured the growing desperation. "American air superiority makes daylight surface operations impossible. Night attacks fail due to superior enemy radar. Request permission to withdraw remaining vessels before they are destroyed without achieving tactical results." Such requests were arriving with increasing frequency from commanders who had once eagerly sought battle against American forces. The submarine reports were even more discouraging. Japanese underwater forces that had been expected to devastate American supply lines were themselves being hunted and destroyed by increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine warfare techniques. Commander Tanaka's latest assessment documented the systematic destruction of Japanese submarine capability. Current operational strength reduced to 37 boats. Average patrol duration decreased due to America's success rate against escorted convoys approaching zero. These tactical assessments arriving from across the Pacific theater painted a picture of comprehensive defeat that could no longer be attributed to temporary setbacks or tactical mistakes. American forces had achieved systematic superiority in every aspect of naval warfare: surface combat, submarine operations, naval aviation, and logistics support. The gap was widening as American industrial production reached levels that Japanese planners had never considered possible. Admiral Yamashiro opened his personal diary, a leather-bound volume where he had recorded his thoughts and observations throughout the war. The early entries, written during the euphoric months following Pearl Harbor, reflected confidence in ultimate Japanese victory and pride in the tactical excellence demonstrated by Japanese forces. The tone had gradually shifted as setbacks accumulated and the true scale of America's. His entry for this evening would mark the formal acknowledgement of defeat, though he hoped that honest assessment might still preserve some portion of Japanese naval power for whatever settlement could be negotiated with the advancing Americans. The alternative, continued resistance without regard for realistic capabilities, threatened to result in the complete destruction of Japan's forces and the elimination of any bargaining power in eventual peace negotiations. September 3, 1943. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Naval General Staff conference room cast deep shadows across the faces of Japan's most senior admirals as they gathered for what many secretly understood would be their final strategic assessment. Admiral Yamashiro entered carrying the leather portfolio that contained his comprehensive analysis of Japanese naval capabilities, knowing that the documents inside would shatter every remaining illusion about Japan's ability to continue effective resistance in the Pacific. Fleet Admiral Nagano, the elderly chief of the Naval General Staff, sat at the head of the polished table that had witnessed countless confident discussions of Japanese expansion and victory. His weathered face bore the strain of months spent reconciling official optimism with increasingly desperate field reports. Around him sat the commanders who had built Japan's naval empire and now faced the impossible task of managing its collapse. Vice Admiral Shimizu, whose Third Fleet had been reduced to a handful of operational destroyers, studied intelligence photographs showing American task forces that dwarfed anything Japan could now deploy. His once immaculate uniform hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight during sleepless nights spent calculating impossible odds against American numerical superiority. "Gentlemen," Admiral Nagano began, his voice betraying none of the emotion that showed in his tired eyes, "Admiral Yamashiro has prepared an assessment of our current operational status. I trust his analysis will provide clarity regarding our strategic options." The formal language concealed the desperate hope that somehow Yamashiro's report might reveal hidden strengths or overlooked opportunities. Yamashiro opened his portfolio and extracted the document that represented weeks of painful analysis. The statistics it contained had been verified multiple times, cross-checked against reports from across the Pacific, and confirmed by intelligence sources whose accuracy could not be questioned. The numbers told a story of systematic defeat that could no longer be masked by tactical victories or propaganda. "Our current operational strength consists of 14 destroyers, 8 cruisers and 2 battleships capable of sustained combat operations," Yamashiro reported with clinical precision. "Carrier aviation has been reduced to fewer than 40 operational aircraft with pilot training levels insufficient for complex missions." Each number landed like a physical blow on officers who remembered when the combined fleet had been the most powerful naval force in history. Admiral Kusaka, whose forces had been evacuated from Rabaul the previous month, interrupted with barely controlled frustration. "Those numbers cannot be accurate. Intelligence reports indicate we have substantially more vessels in various stages of repair and refit." His protest reflected the psychological difficulty of accepting the magnitude of Japanese losses. "The figures include only vessels capable of immediate deployment," Yamashiro replied quietly. "Ships requiring extensive repair or lacking adequate crews have been excluded from operational totals." This clarification eliminated any remaining hope that damaged vessels might somehow compensate for the documented losses. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded carrier forces during the early victories, spoke with the hollow voice of a man who had watched his life's work destroyed. "What of our submarine force, intelligence assets, coastal defense capabilities?" His questions reflected the desperate search for any remaining sources of strength that might provide bargaining power in eventual negotiations. Captain Tanaka, who had accompanied Yamashiro to provide detailed analysis, consulted his notes before responding. "Submarine operations have been severely compromised by American anti-submarine warfare improvements. Current operational strength is 28 boats, with average patrol effectiveness reduced to negligible levels due to enemy countermeasures." The submarine reports had been particularly devastating to read. Japanese underwater forces that had once terrorized Allied shipping were now being systematically hunted and destroyed by American destroyer escorts equipped with advanced detection equipment. The hunters had become the hunted, with Japanese submarine commanders reporting that survival rather than tactical success had become their primary objective. "Intelligence capabilities have been similarly degraded," Tanaka continued. "American electronic warfare superiority has rendered most of our radio intercept stations ineffective, while their operational security prevents penetration of their communication networks." This admission touched on one of the most puzzling aspects of recent defeats: the apparent American ability to anticipate Japanese movements while keeping their own plans completely secret. Fleet Admiral Nagano absorbed these revelations in silence before asking the question that every officer present dreaded hearing answered. "What is your assessment of American capabilities in comparison to our remaining strength?" The mathematical calculation of relative power would provide the final confirmation of Japan's hopeless position. Yamashiro had prepared for this moment, knowing that his answer would effectively acknowledge the end of Japanese naval power in the Pacific. American Pacific Fleet strength now includes 24 aircraft carriers, 47 destroyers, 40 torpedo and 40s, and 12 battleships. Their industrial production is launching new vessels faster than we can sink them, while their training programs are producing pilots and sailors in numbers that exceed our total remaining personnel. The silence that followed this assessment was broken only by the distant sound of air raid sirens, a reminder that American bombers were now attacking targets within Japan itself. The nation that had once projected power across thousands of miles of ocean was reduced to defending its own coastline against increasingly frequent raids. Admiral Shimizu finally voiced what every man in the room was thinking. Given these circumstances, what options remain available to us? The question implicitly acknowledged that traditional concepts of victory were no longer relevant to Japan's strategic situation. We can continue current operations until our remaining vessels are destroyed, Yamashiro replied with brutal honesty. We can attempt to concentrate our forces for a final decisive battle that would likely result in complete annihilation of Japanese naval power, or we can preserve our remaining capabilities for use in negotiated settlement discussions. The third option had never been officially discussed in military circles, though it had been the subject of countless private conversations among senior officers who understood the mathematical impossibility of continued effective resistance. Suggesting negotiated peace bordered on defeatism, a charge that could result in disgrace or worse for any officer brave enough to advocate surrender. Vice Admiral Ozawa leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. What terms might we expect from the Americans? Have there been any diplomatic communications regarding potential settlement? His questions reflected the growing realization that continued fighting might only worsen Japan. All official communications have been received, Admiral Nagano replied carefully. However, intelligence sources suggest that America's demands would include complete withdrawal from occupied territories, reduction of Japanese naval forces to coastal defense capabilities, and acceptance of American oversight of Japanese military development. These conditions represented the complete reversal of everything Japan had sought to achieve through war. The room erupted in angry protests as several officers simultaneously denounced the possibility of accepting such humiliating terms. Admiral Kusaka's voice rose above the others. Japanese naval honor cannot survive such disgrace. We have obligations to the Emperor and to the men who have died for the Empire that prevent consideration of surrender. Captain Tanaka waited for the protests to subside before presenting analysis that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Continued resistance with our current capabilities will result in the destruction of our remaining forces within 6 months. The question is whether that destruction serves any strategic purpose or merely increases the eventual cost of inevitable defeat. This cold assessment forced the assembled officers to confront the fundamental choice facing Japanese military leadership. Honor and tradition demanded continued resistance regardless of cost, while pragmatic analysis suggested that further fighting would only worsen Japan's position without achieving any meaningful tactical or strategic objectives. Admiral Yamashiro opened another section of his portfolio, revealing correspondence from field commanders that documented the human cost of continued operations. Letters from destroyer captains described crews demoralized by repeated defeats. Reports from submarine commanders detailed the psychological strain of operating in waters dominated by enemy forces. Communications from base commanders throughout the Pacific painted pictures of isolated garrisons awaiting inevitable American assault. The morale situation has become critical, Yamashiro reported. Field commanders are requesting permission to withdraw from untenable positions, evacuate unnecessary personnel, and consolidate forces at defensible locations. The alternative is the piecemeal destruction of our remaining capabilities without corresponding damage to America. For cares. Till. One letter from Captain Morishita, commanding the remnants of a destroyer squadron, captured the desperation felt throughout Japanese naval forces. American air superiority makes daylight operations impossible. Night attacks fail due to superior enemy radar and coordinated defensive responses. Request immediate reinforcement or permission to withdraw before squadron is completely destroyed. Similar appeals were arriving from across the Pacific as Japanese commanders found themselves in impossible tactical situations with inadequate resources to achieve meaningful results. The pattern of requests revealed an organization that was disintegrating under pressure it could no longer effectively resist. Fleet Admiral Nagano studied the assembled documentation before addressing the central question that had brought them together. Assuming that continued resistance is militarily futile, what recommendations would you make regarding preservation of Japanese naval capabilities for post-war reconstruction? The question represented a fundamental shift from consideration of victory to planning for survival. Immediate withdrawal of all remaining vessels to home waters, Yamashiro replied without hesitation. Concentration of forces for coastal defense rather than offensive operations. preservation of experienced personnel for future training and development programs. Most importantly, acknowledgement that our current strategic situation requires fundamental changes in Japanese naval doctrine. This recommendation represented the complete abandonment of Japanese offensive capabilities in favor of defensive measures designed to preserve some remnant of naval power for an uncertain future. The psychological impact on officers who had dedicated their careers to projecting Japanese power across the Pacific was devastating to witness. Vice Admiral Shimizu voiced the concern that troubled every man present: how do we explain such a reversal to subordinate officers who have been promised victory through superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence? What do we tell the families of men who have died believing their sacrifice served a greater purpose? The question touched on the moral complexity of military leadership during wartime. Officers who had sent men into battle based on strategic assumptions that had proven false now faced the obligation to acknowledge their errors while maintaining sufficient morale and discipline to execute whatever orders emerged from their deliberations. Admiral Yamashiro had prepared for this question during the long nights spent analyzing Japan's military failure. We tell them the truth about American industrial capabilities that exceeded our intelligence estimates. We acknowledge that fighting spirit and tactical skill, while admirable, cannot overcome material disadvantages of the magnitude we now face. We honor their service while accepting responsibility for strategic miscalculations that placed them in impossible situations. The admission of error by senior leadership represented a break with Japanese military tradition that emphasized infallibility of command decisions and absolute obedience to superior orders. However, the magnitude of their strategic failure made traditional approaches to command responsibility inadequate for the crisis they faced. As the meeting progressed into its fourth hour, the weight of accumulated evidence made continued debate pointless. Every statistical analysis, every field report, and every intelligence assessment pointed to the same conclusion: Japanese naval power in the Pacific had been effectively eliminated as a strategic factor in the war's outcome. Captain Tanaka presented the final section of their analysis, documenting American preparations for what appeared to be direct assault on the Japanese home islands. Intelligence indicates massive American fleet concentrations in the Philippine Sea, supported by logistics capabilities that suggest sustained operations close to Japanese waters. Their next objective appears to be establishment of advanced bases within bombing range of industrial targets on Honshu. This development represented the ultimate failure of Japanese defensive strategy. The Pacific Ocean, which Japanese planners had viewed as a protective barrier that would enable them to defeat American forces at great distance from Japan, had become a highway for advancing enemy fleets equipped with capabilities that Japanese forces could no longer contest effectively. The meeting concluded with Fleet Admiral Nagano's directive that individual fleet commanders prepare contingency plans for both continued resistance and organized withdrawal to defensive positions closer to Japan. The compromise reflected the political impossibility of formally recommending surrender while acknowledging the military necessity of preserving whatever Japanese naval capabilities might survive the war's conclusion. Admiral Yamashiro gathered his documents, knowing that his honest assessment had effectively ended his military career regardless of its accuracy. Officers who acknowledged defeat even when defeat was mathematically certain risked being branded as defeatists by superiors desperate to maintain illusions of continued resistance. As the senior officers filed out of the conference room, their conversations were subdued and private. The burden of knowledge they now carried would influence every decision they made in the months ahead, though official policy would continue to emphasize resistance and eventual victory until the war's end. The final entry in Admiral Yamashiro's personal diary that evening captured the profound sadness felt by professional officers forced to acknowledge the destruction of everything they had worked to build. We have been defeated not by superior Japanese courage or tactical skill, but by industrial capabilities we never understood and communication security we could never achieve. The Pacific belongs to America now, and our role has become the management of honorable surrender rather than the pursuit of impossible victory. The men who had commanded the world's most powerful navy 18 months earlier now faced the reality that American industrial might, technological superiority, and strategic patience had systematically eliminated Japanese naval power as a factor in Pacific warfare. Their final task would be preserving enough of their organization to serve whatever role Japan might play in a world dominated by the forces that had defeated them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.